change our general approach to our subject, because we are dealing with an entirely different class of basic material. We have been telling the stories of the great mythological systems and the fables and legends of the gods which have arisen at the dawn of human experience. We have dealt essentially with situations that belong in the pattern of prehistory. Now, of course, some mythologies are much older than others. But in each instance, they emerge with the rise of a culture or of a culture group. Thus, they have to do with a thought such as once upon a time, long before ordinary, prosaic things were taking place in the world, certain other events were transpiring. And these other events belong to an old time when the gods walked with men. And these things, in our way of thinking, were long ago and deeply submerged beneath the surface of a rising materialistic culture. Thus they come to us through the age of fable, and come also as stories, sustained by certain relics of art and archaeology. This approach is not suitable for the study of Buddhism, because we are dealing with an entirely different concept of life. And in order to understand the redemption myth or myths of this sect, we have to realize that we are no longer dealing with prehistory, but with an unhistorical state of affairs. In substance, then, we must begin by differentiating two concepts in Buddhism, without which much of our struggle or effort will be fruitless. The Buddhist legends cannot be interpreted by listening, or even by a general thoughtfulness. They must be interpreted from a concept, from an idea consistent with themselves, and as we would naturally approach them as in terms of comparative mythology, we would be at a disadvantage immediately. In Buddhism, there were two great schools, called the large vehicle and the small vehicle. The large vehicle was the Mahayana, and the small vehicle was the Hinayana. In the Hinayana system, the end of the Buddhist disciplines was the perfection of the Arhat. And we have the concept of this strange being who includes many of the ideas we associate with saints and with patriarchs and with great sages. The Arhat lived a solitary existence. He renounced the world. He renounced worldliness in all its parts and in all its departments. And he retired to some secluded place, perhaps into the wilderness or into the forest, or perhaps into the house of some religious order. And here he devoted himself to the clarification of his own consciousness. We cannot deny that this man was not only good, but profoundly sincere. And because of the intensity of the disciplines to which he subjected himself, he gained a broad reputation for holiness. And gradually around him there sprang up a cycle of myths and legends miraculous powers and attributes which were the result of a complete dedication to the mystery of being. This Arhat not only represented the production or product of a system. In the oldest records that we have, Buddha himself stands in the position of an Arhat. In this, he is sustained by his own concept. But in a mysterious way, he was neither God nor man. He was a Buddha. And in this peculiar sense of isolation, he rejected not only the limitations of humanity, but the grandeur of the Arhat concept, or the grandeur of the idea of being a divine person, or one peculiarly and inevitably the channel of a divine purpose. Buddha originally did not invest himself with these attributes, but he was a great saint, a great sage, a great philosopher. And in these degrees, he was human, he was mortal, he was a person. But within and beyond this person was an achievement, an attainment, a more or less complete and perfect adjustment with the mystery of ever becoming, which is really the foundation of the whole Buddhist belief. On the opposite polarity to this doctrine, there gradually rose the Mahayana school, or the school of the Bodhisattva doctrine. Now, a Bodhisattva was conceived as a being also, but entirely different in essential nature with an Arhat. It was not inconceivable that one could appear in the form of the other. But behind the two concepts was an essential difference, and perhaps the easiest way of explaining that difference would be by recourse to a more familiar situation, and that is medieval Christianity. During the medieval period of the rise of the Christian religion, two classes of religious persons gradually were distinguished. One of these classes was called the class of the monks, and the other was the class of the friars. Now, the difference between the monk and the friar was almost the same as the difference between the Hinayana and the Mahayana saint or sage. The monk was very likely to retire into the houses of his order, and there to remain. Perhaps his principal industry was the illumining of missals and the preparation of works of art. He seldom, if ever, ventured into the world. He remained secluded, bound by obligations, for his principal purpose was to serve the God he worshipped through the renunciation of a material life and the dedication of every power and attribute of his consciousness to the contemplation of the mystery and will of God. The friar, however, had a somewhat different estate, and perhaps of the orders of friars, the one with which we are most familiar is the Franciscan order. Here we have a group of persons dedicated to God, but who also recognized in this dedication a very present and real ministry to the immediate needs of their fellow men. The friars went out and worked. Their religion was based upon ministering to the sheep. They were the ones who took the attitude that holy life was expressed most perfectly through the service of those who needed help. Both were dedicated, but there was quite a difference in the psychological foundation of the two dedications. In Buddhism, then, we have the Arhat, who corresponds with the monk, and who represents Bodhisattva, however, represents an almost complete, infinite, or perfect expression of ministry. He was not merely out serving those physically and immediately needy. He represented a being totally dedicated to the extension of enlightenment for all men. He had taken an oath or an obligation, which has been called sometimes the Great Renunciation. As part of his basic worship, he had sworn that he would not seek peace, reality, or the nirvana for himself until the least of creatures could enter this great state with him. He therefore returned to labor, whereas in the small vehicle, the southern school, he would return no more. He would pass into the supreme state, or the ultimate essence of being, having fulfilled the perfection of himself. Now there has been some division in thinking as to the selfishness or unselfishness, the ethics and the morality of these paths. I think such discussion can have no essential meaning. There is no doubt in the world that the Arhat of the Southern School made every sacrifice conceivable to his consciousness. His sincerity, his integrity, and his devotion cannot be doubted or questioned. But he had the concept, the strange concept, that it was his duty not to save, not to attempt the redemption of others. For in so doing, he strangely restricted them. He believed that the supreme achievement must be by the natural growth of each creature. Therefore, that the teacher cannot teach. That the experience of growth can only be experienced through suffering and on to the great road that leads to enlightenment. In the Mahayana, however, the possibility of one person serving another, the development of the concept of reality as a state of bhakti or love, and that love expressed itself through the supreme compassion of man, that the perfect service was self-forgetfulness in love, and therefore that this path also led, and to the northern school led most directly to the supreme realization. The individual realized even by forgetting the realization, by submerging it in the immediate need of suffering humankind. Thus the Arhat, in his growth, did not develop or is not associated with the same psychic attributes as the Bodhisattva. The Arhat was not assumed or presumed to be capable of the universal consciousness of the suffering of unenlightened things. His advancement was through the gradual shutting out of all except reality, whereas the Bodhisattva's concept was the extension and sensitizing of his own power, so that for him understanding was largely the result of his own infinite capacity to understand everything, the greater and the lesser, the good and the bad. They were all united in one vast understanding, an utter and complete sensitivity, not only to reality, but to the illusion. A sensitivity which at the same time did not incur involvement. Thus, in the advanced texts of Mahayana, we have long and carefully arranged lists of the powers and attributes of the Bodhisattva. And these powers and attributes sometimes cause us to pause and wonder whether there has not been a little borrowing or exchanging between certain religious beliefs. We know that Mahayana actually arose as a powerful religion or religious motion or concept prior to the beginning of the Christian era. We also realize, however, that it was influenced to some degree by the motion of Nestorian Christianity into Asia. There can be no doubt that some of the parallels are almost too exact to be explained in any other way. For example, in the Mahayana concept, there cannot be but one Buddha. In other words, all bodhisattvas do not become Buddhas. They become Buddha. And in this realization, the entire road or path of achievement ends in a vast, almost inconceivable state of identity, an utter and complete unity. Therefore, a Buddha, presuming that, like Gautama, he took upon himself the appearance of body or became embodied in order that he might accomplish the ministry for which he was intended. The Buddha thus could say, before Abraham was, I am. The Buddha could say that all preceding Buddha beings existed in him, and that he existed in them. He could therefore regard himself not only as the firstborn of totality, but also the eternal embodiment of all that might exist in the nirvanic state. He would therefore also be able to say, in departing, that he went to prepare a place for those who were his disciples, and that when they achieved the nirvana, they would become himself, and he would become themselves. That there could be but one end. And in this concept, Buddhism postulates a transcendent ever-becoming as the total end of all existence. Scholars have been working for a long time to determine, if possible, that part of the Buddhist philosophy which must be present in order to complete the concept of the Mahaparinirvana. In other words, where does being go when it passes from the state of being to the state of ever becoming? This question is essentially the core of Buddhistic metaphysics. And there seems to be only one conceivable answer. In fact, this answer is sustained by practically all Buddhist scholars of the classical period. And it is that this nirvana or parinirvana, which is the extinction of the cognitions and the sensations, is in no sense annihilation, is in no sense the total extinction of anything. Perhaps Platonism was affected by this concept, for while the Greeks never achieved to the subtlety of the Indian thinker, Plato was aware of the fact that in some way this material world in which we live corresponded not to a normal abode, but to a purgatorial state. In other words, this was a world of ignorance, ruled by ignorance, perpetuated by the ignorance in things. Therefore, if this sphere of material existence as we know it is an illusion sustained by a sequence of delusions operating through karma, then departure from this world was not departure from a factual to a non-factual state, but a departure from a non-factual to a factual state. The difficulty rested in the fact that man, depending entirely upon those aggregates which are called skandhas, had no way of conceiving reality. Therefore, to him, unreality was factual and reality was an illusion. The departure from the state of the individual in a delusional condition to a condition in which delusion does not exist might therefore be likened to waking from a dream. The individual, living in a state of sleep and accepting beyond question the reality of sleep phenomena, is placed in a predicament. Psychologically speaking, suppose that we divided the life of man, day and night, sleeping and waking, into two equal periods, and presume that he had an equal period of dreaming for his period of waking. Let us then, for a moment, assume that his state of dreaming, instead of consisting of a series of unrelated sleep phenomena, that this state of dreaming was itself a continuous unfolding process, so that each person began his next night's dreaming where the previous one left off, and continued this throughout life, so that his dream state had the same sequences and the same consistencies as his waking state. Under such conditions, how could he tell when he was awake and when he was asleep? He is able to distinguish because sleep phenomena is inconsistent, in the sense that it is a series of fragments, that these fragments differ, change, sometimes are present and sometimes are not present. Therefore, he accepts a continuous state of waking as reality and rejects an inconsistent, non-continuous state of dreaming as unreality. There have been a few examples known in which sleep phenomena was consistent throughout life. Those who have passed through this state have never been able to clearly distinguish their own condition. One example was a man who did dream continuously and consecutively of another life. In his day, he had a comparatively humble position. At night, a more important estate. He followed this dream sequence, dreaming of his growth from childhood to maturity, at the same time that physically he was passing from childhood to maturity. The dream continued throughout life without any eccentricities. While in the dream state, this individual could speak and could answer questions, much as though in a hypnotic state. While in the dream state, he insisted that his dream life was reality and had no awareness of his so-called waking state, except that he occasionally dreamt something strange, and the thing he was dreaming was his objective life. When he was awakened and his objectivity was established, then he was the other person, and only admitted that he could dream of another state in which he had a different existence. Our problem, of course, lies, as Buddhist psychology points out, in the fact that we have a polarization or focal point in objectivity. Thus we assume and conceive objectivity to be reality. Now perhaps this is all a tempest in a teapot. Perhaps it really makes no difference whether the waking state or the dream state is reality. Many people will think that. But there is one difference that Buddha very carefully pointed out. And that is that in what we call the waking state of man, life is unsatisfactory. If life here, in this waking state, was conclusive and solutional, if human beings gradually devised a pattern by which they led a satisfactory, integrated existence and could adjust themselves to this world in a manner which did not result in what is termed in Buddhism the great misery, there would be no further problem involved. Buddha was essentially a utilitarian. The abstract phases of his doctrine he was not as much concerned with as he was with the normal daily problem of the human being, seeking to find the solution to the infirmities with which he was continuously afflicted. Buddhism therefore took the attitude that these infirmities are due to the substitution of an illusion for a reality, and that man, because of his polarization here, was afraid to leave behind him the very hindrances which were the source of his greatest unhappiness. The condition of reality, then, was not merely an abstraction, not a void actually, but a void only in the sense that man was unable to comprehend it. To step into it was to step into the unknown. But Buddha pointed out that the unknown is the real, and that therefore the step into the unknown is not into darkness but out of darkness, and that the person regretfully leaving this sphere for some other is actually leaving behind that which is useless and coming into the presence of that which is useful. Thus, the void, the unknown, the abstraction, the total extinction of personality, which to the Western mind has always seemed dreadful, does not mean that to the Easterner. It simply means that the person is passing into a state of total, essential reality, and leaving behind him a condition in which that reality is not only unavailable at the moment, but inconceivable. If then there be a religious foundation to the entire concept, it is this sense of faith by which Buddhism inspired its follower to have faith in totality, even though he could not comprehend it. Now, as we also realize that in Buddhism there was a strong revulsion against the Brahmanic theogony, or the great Brahmanic concept of deities, and these deities were gradually modified into psychological fixations or mental images. It would be quite obvious that they could not have the same type of creation myth or the same kind of God fable or legend as that which would be found among peoples who did believe that the universe was the production of a creating person or a creating being, assisted or sustained or manifesting through a great cycle or circle of secondary formative divinities or godlings. If this difference be taken into consideration, then we see why in Buddhism myths, legends, and fables cannot relate primarily to gods. They must all relate to men. They must all relate to the degrees of emancipation through which the human being passes in his path from ignorance to perfection. Also in this concept, in this philosophy, there cannot be any doctrine of original sin, nor can there be a factual agent of evil opposing a factual agent of good. Therefore, the tremendous drama of the conflict of good and evil, as we mentioned it last week in the Sigurd Saga, or the Valsund Saga, this tremendous battle upon the plain of Ragnarok, in which the forces of good and the forces of evil, represented by gods and demons, locked in one terrible war, the Armageddon of the Nordic lands. This cannot be included, or could not have a parallel in Buddhist philosophy. Nor could there be the concept, actually, of avatars in Buddhism, or being sent by a supreme being for the purpose of the redemption of mankind. Thus, what we find when we begin to examine the Buddhistic lore is a series of legends which pass from a very pure, almost agnostic beginning through a series of enlargements and modifications to become gradually encrusted with accumulations from various nations and people brought to Buddhism as partial converts. We therefore can have and do find in Buddhism elements and fragments from over 40 different religious beliefs. These were imposed upon the pure stream of Buddhist metaphysics. A good example, of course, is your Pon doctrine in Tibet, where from the combination of an ancient and indigenous belief with Buddhism came what we call the doctrine of the Lamas. These represent compounds. They do not intensify our understanding of the direct descent of essential Buddhism. Thus we have two general degrees of legendary. These patterns have to do with, of course, rebirth and karma. They have to do with rebirth, as in the case of the Jatakas, which are the life or birth stories of the Buddha as he is supposed to have related them to his disciples. These stories are concerned with his own previous embodiments and the processes by means of which the karma in his own sattvic compound was gradually dissolved. Thus these fables are highly moralistic inasmuch as they are keyed to the grand concept of cause producing effect, effect producing cause, and so on until the extinction of cause, not the exhaustion of effect. Because wherever cause exists, effect is inevitable. Only the end of causation can bring about the end of effect. This is the burden of a broad cycle and circle of legends, which not only indicate the conditions which lead to rebirth, but also point finally to the ultimate residue of karma in the present embodiment. Now, Buddha made a statement that we are not too familiar with, but which I think is very relevant. Buddha warned his disciples to accept the doctrine that they were living out in this embodiment previous causations. But he furthermore pointed out that these causations through many lives had become so confused, so involved, so complicated, so inevitably tangled, that the human being could not, from the mere contemplation of the conditions now existing, arrive at a true apperception of their original causes. He therefore warned the individual not to meditate upon his own karma in the sense of an auto-diagnosis of the reason for his existing infirmities, to accept that there is a reason, but to recognize also that his interpretations arising from faculties incapable of conveying reality could not possibly be profitable to him, and might lead, as he himself says, to the gravest despair and disconsolation, and might even tend towards madness. It was not profitable. But the Jataka tales and many similar stories and the reminiscent legends which arise connected with the lives of various Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and Arhats are all essentially key to the belief that all these antecedent causes are necessary to the existing present state of things, and that the consciousness which is achieving emancipation is doing so by transcending not only karmic consequences, but the inclination of the sensatory system to create further karma. So we have a whole group of legends which have a strange kind of morality under them. Morality which teaches man to pay his debts. Morality which reminds him, perhaps, that those whom he now regards as most sanctified and most holy have passed through the same infirmities as himself. That they are not a different substance. Therefore, that anything they have accomplished, he can accomplish. This is an important moral conclusion, for he discovers that even being a sinner, he can become a saint. He becomes a saint by paying his debts and making no more debts of the same kind. The mere paying of debt will not do it. The resolution not to make more debts will not do it. Both have to be present together. He cannot evade the responsibility of action. Therefore, he must be patient. And Buddhism had a tremendously strong ethical point in the fact that because we are good, we cannot immediately wipe away all ill that we have previously done. Good must bring with it patience. The patience to pay the bill with understanding, enlightenment, and charity. And this patience the individual from the further consequences of previous conduct. But he may still remain a conduct-causing creature. And to prevent the continuation of conduct, he must transcend action on the objective or illusionary sphere. Thus, the suspension of action is the only solution to liberation from the consequences of action. There is no other way. Now, this will cause a considerable amount of misunderstanding among Western people. We become of the mind that Buddha is teaching doing nothing, or a do-nothingness. Yet, as the old saints themselves pointed out, the suspension of action is quite a little job in itself. It takes more work than all the activity that we now perform. For the suspension of action cannot arise merely from volitional control by the will. The suspension of action is a byproduct of the exhaustion of ignorance. While ignorance remains, action cannot be suspended. So the individual who believes that the suspension of action is the end of his usefulness is taking the attitude that he is useful only to the degree that he is ignorant. He doesn't think of it that way, but if he follows the thinking through, he finds that logic will bring some rather strange conclusions. So in our legends and fables, we are informed furthermore of the importance of the suspension of action, and various examples are given to exemplify the means by which such things are done and the ends to be attained thereby. Buddhism also carries with it another totally separate line of symbolism. In this case, also legendary and lore. Because from legend, lore, and fable can also be created a series of mandalas, which may either be in picture or in form or in term. Therefore, an example of the conduct of an arhat or a sanctified being may become a meditation focus, which causes the disciple to attempt to understand the meaning of an obscure statement or a curious and involved incident or a pretty fable drawn in a strange, daring stroke, like some of the nihilistic and apparently utterly cryptic formulas of Zen, which seem to be almost incomprehensible themselves. Buddhism, recognizing that its primary end was to convey the incomprehensible, realized that there was no direct method of achieving this. No direct wording, no preachment that could do it. So we take one of the legends which relates to the occasion in which Buddha was preaching at the Vulture's Peak. And it was at that time that he was resolved to communicate the mystery of the heart doctrine, or the kernel, the seed, the essence of the Mahayana. A householder had brought to the master a blue lotus in a bowl. He bowed very humbly and presented this lotus to the teacher. The Great One received the lotus with a smile and an inclination of the head which was a benediction, and which filled the heart of the householder with inconceivable comfort face was illumined with a tremendous light. And the Buddha turned to him and said, "You have received the doctrine." No word was spoken. Now this is a fable, a legend, perhaps the basis of a transmission. We are not sure. For in all legends, we do not know what is factual and what is allegorical. But this is a typical type of Buddhist legend. It is a legend which has none of the objective drama of the great Nordic or the Egyptian cycles or the Greek mythology. It is a legend, however, which calls tremendously upon the person who hears it or the person who reads it. For he begins to attempt through this to conceive the inconceivable. He tries to understand what Buddha conveyed and how, and why this conveyance could not be in words. And if there were no words, how the disciple received it. I told this to one man one day, and he said, "It's very evident. Thought transference." A typical Western out. No, because if it could be conveyed in thought, it could be conveyed in words. After all, thoughts can be embodied, either in phrases, or in pictures, or in terms of some kind. Perhaps the embodiment may not be perfect, but a conveyance of that which can be formed into intellectual image is possible. What the Buddha bestowed could not be thought, nor could the transmission of it be thought, because that which he conveyed partook to some measure of reality, and reality is beyond thought. The only thing that thought can do about reality is postulate it. It can affirm it, but it can never define it. Therefore, that which was transmitted upon a different level. And it is said that after this transmission, the doctrine was temporarily lost. But a very interesting thing happened. While the great teacher was at the vulture's peak, and was thus engaged in the quiet transmission of the law, there were beings present who could not be seen. And these beings were the serpent spirits, who had already proved that they received or had participated in the doctrine, because one of the inevitable signs of the embodiment of the Great One is that the serpent spirits shall cast flowers upon this being and shall strew its path with flowers. And these beings had done so, thereby indicating that they had recognized the embodiment. But these beings, these serpent spirits, also received the transmission at the same time the disciple did, but they were invisible. But it was preserved by them in an iron tower in a mysterious world, and it was later there discovered by the great Buddhist saint Nagarjuna, who gave it to the world. Here is a legend. But you see, it's an entirely different type of legend from Odin wandering around the earth with one eye, or the Cyclops attacking the ship of Ulysses. Actually, the meanings might not be so different in essence, but the portrayal and the level of their impact upon consciousness is very different. The legends then take upon themselves the second peculiar phase or quality. They become, as in the case of the life of Jesus, which is perhaps the nearest thing to a Buddhist legend that we have in the Western world. Because in this legend we have, essentially, as it is presented in the Gospels, the simple story of a good man teaching through example. Now this would come very, very close to the substance of Buddhism. For your Buddhist fable, involving the lives of sanctified beings, consists almost exclusively of teaching through example, of presenting the doctrine in an infinite diversity of ways. There is no answer in Buddhism to the great mysteries of how something came out of nothing. There is no essential cosmogony as we know it. There is nothing of creation, because Buddhism does not assume creation to be real. Thus, there is not a vast architectural device from which things come or to which things conform. There is a river, an ever-flowing stream of eternal becoming. This, of course, is not its real name, but it is the nearest name which he could devise. Therefore, it is not a statement of reality, but a minimum statement of illusion. It is the least illusionary statement conceivable. If, then, we go into the psychology of Buddhism, particularly the Mahayana school, we have what at first appears to be a theogenic element. For we learn that at the root of things is a supposedly supreme being, and that this supreme being, in a state of eternal meditation, causes illusion as an experience within itself, and by will and yoga projects phenomena. This, however, again, is a fable, a legend. For by the Supreme Being is meant the same thing, nirvana, or the being state becoming. And in Buddhism, there are no deities except those which are conjured into existence by some kind of conditioned intelligence. The deities do not make men. Men make the deities. Now, that would cause someone to say, perhaps, that Buddhism is attacking our entire concept of life, and therefore that Buddhism is denying the gods, or denying the existence of gods. It does no such thing. It simply declares that they are conjured into being by intelligence. They do not deny that this intelligence can create vast thought forms, which might almost be likened to archetypal patterns within the psychic life of the human being. Nor does Buddhism deny that the psychic patterns of individuals become aggregates or unite to form what might be termed collective archetypes. And that deity, as we know it, is the collective archetype or projection of mind upon space. Now this does not mean that one mind created in the sense of one human mind, but they are mind-born, and we are inclined to assume that they are born from the mind of God. But Buddhism says no. They are born from mind per se, which is itself a condition which is incapable of the experience of reality. Thus, we can approach this situation in another way. Suppose at the moment an individual will say to you, or we think within ourselves, when we get out of this embodiment, we will not come back. Now that is a decision that a number of persons have made. The weight of the decision is a little doubtful, but at least it is enthusiastic. Now we have a whole group of fables to help us out, right, at this particular point. So, when we say we will go elsewhere, or we will not come back, we are affirming our existence in some other state. So our friend will naturally and quite reasonably ask us where we are going and what we think the state is going to be. Now perhaps we will admit ignorance. We don't know. This is the most simple statement. This is a primary statement merely of the fact that we are convinced of survival. Beyond that, we are not certain. But if we belong to almost any belief or philosophy, life, or religion, we have some kind of a concept as to where we are going. So perhaps if we have had a very difficult life and a very confused one, we will say, well, there's one thing I know. I'm going where there's no more trouble. So we begin to describe what to us is heaven. Last week we spoke about the Nordic concept of Asgard, or the wonderful banquet hall of Valhalla. Here, the warriors who were picked up by the Valkyrie from the field of battle were carried to the great banquet hall that was made with walls of spears and roofs of shields. And in this banquet hall, people ate all night and fought all day. And it was a perfectly delightful prospect. We feel that we have totally outgrown any such naivete as that. So we say, well, we're going where it is wonderful and beautiful. And if we are pressed further, we may go to say, well, there'll be no winter there. There'll be no sorrow there. There will be no care. Perhaps we will even go with the Egyptian and declare that we will have our own little 40 acres which we will plow. And we will have our own house, but there will be no bankers, no landlords, and no mortgages. So by degrees we fashion some kind of an image of what we think a really satisfactory heaven would be like. Of course, we always hope we'll make it, but as we analyze our own conduct and read the credo, we wonder whether we will make it or not. We may be inspired with the fact that we're not quite good enough to be certain of this desirable and delectable future. But what have we actually done? We have merely fashioned another sphere just like our own. The only thing we have done, we have molded it closer to our heart's desire, as Omar says. This heaven is just here, minus the difficulties. It is attenuated, yes. We may be able to walk through walls. We may not need to bother opening doors. Of course, we are no longer much interested in harps and wings. They're a little bit too difficult. But still, what do we actually have as a conception? We have terms such as there will be no parting there. We have ideas, but they are mostly relief from the oppression of material. And we assume a condition. Now, I've known a number of individuals who, having this thought in mind, departed from this confusion of ours and entered socialized communities, small groups that had already resolved to live that way, and were, to a degree, doing so. In a few months, the new member was bored to distraction, for he gradually realized that it wasn't the pressures of his environment that caused him misery, It was the pressure in himself that caused him misery. And no matter where he went, he took it with him. Also, that in some way, his future state depended totally upon some kind of a consciousness in himself. So the Buddhist fable tells us that a great prince of India died and came to the mysterious gate that leads into the world beyond, perhaps in the older concept, the paradise of Indra. And at the door, the gatekeeper, who must have been a Buddhist, there's no question about it. In fact, there is a legend that they used Buddhists in those strategic positions. But in any event, the gatekeeper very quietly and very subtly looked at the new arrival and said, "Who are you?" The man said, "I am the Prince of India." And instantly, paradise vanished. Everything disappeared, and the prince found himself falling headlong into a new embodiment. Why? Because he had answered the question badly. When asked what he was, or who he was, he might have gotten in if he had said, "I do not know." But when he said, "I am a Prince of India," he identified himself with his body and went right back to it again. Because it was also his body that was a Prince of India. And if he believed that he was the Prince of India, then he was merely speaking for his body. He was not emancipated. He was not free. He was still bound to such a simple thing as a title. If another man had gone there, and the gatekeeper had said to him, "Who are you?" and this man had said, "I am John Smith of Milwaukee," he probably would have fallen into re-embodiment also, because he would have identified that which was at that time separate from body with that which was body. Such is the subtlety of the fables, always working upon the principles involved. In the Northern School, the gradual rise of it resulted in the integration of a middle concept between illusion and reality. And this middle concept became the paradise of Amitabha. Now, the paradise of Amitabha was a beautiful world. A world built upon shores of gold. It was filled with flowers and trees and fountains, and the flowers were covered with jewels. And in this world were magnificent shrines and temples, and all things that were beautiful. And here, it is said, from morn till night could be heard the chanting of the Lohans, the wonderful songs of those who were dedicated to the law. And high above, or in the midst of this magnificent place, rose the wonderful gabled temple and palace of the great being Amitabha, the Lord of enlightened love. And here, the souls of those who had achieved to goodness and to virtue passed after death. Now the wondrous glories of Sukhavati's halls correspond very closely with the Christian story of the New Jerusalem as found in the book of Revelation. And it corresponds in the Mahayana concept with that wonderful line, that thundering edge of the razor which divides the false and true. The paradise of Amitabha is the least of illusion. It is that state in which action, having achieved to goodness, achieves also to the positive pole of unreality, which is goodness, virtue. But it is still bound to the concept, I am good. The being says, as it departs from this life, I have kept the doctrine, I have lived the life, I have practiced the disciplines, I have attained the merit. I have done these things. Therefore, I am entitled to go to heaven. So, if it be true, and if the inner life of the individual is as truly dedicated as it would appear that it is, then according to Buddhism, this being enters into Sukhavati's halls, into the halls of the wonderful paradise that is ruled over by the radiant Bodhisattva or Buddha Amitabha. This, however, does not exist in Southern Buddhism, for in that school there is only illusion and reality. Nothing can come between. Either the individual is immersed in the dream or he is awake. But the Mahayanas discovered that there are certain degrees of waking and sleeping, and that the majority of beings, so-called, have not yet and cannot yet achieve the liberation, yet have merit. And for this merit, there must be the psychic karma. And this psychic karma, for the doing of good, is represented by the mystery of Amitabha's paradise. Here the individual is still self, but has become the virtuous self, the pure self, but has not yet consented to the supreme step, which is the recognition of the annihilation of the doer of the act. Now, Buddhism has a very subtle point also, that man only thinks that he is the performer of action. Actually, acts perform him. There is a mysterious sense in which the person is indeed the pen in the hand of the ready writer. For the doer of the action is the product of the action and not the cause of it. Now this is exceedingly subtle. Why is the doer of the action the consequence of it and not the cause of it? Because the doer of the action is suspended in the interval between dharma and karma. The doer of the action is the product of previous action and can have no other existence or nature. And in the exhaustion of the karma of the action, the doer of the action also becomes extinct. Now this is pretty subtle, but it can again be exemplified by a series of stories, of legends. Legends which circle around the various saints. Let us take one very simple one. Once upon a time, there is supposed to have been a Buddhist saint, one of the old Lohans. And this Lohan had a very great desire to visit another country. And so he decided that he would sit down and try to devise a means of getting there. So he quietly entered into meditation, and he meditated upon the fact that he required to visit another country. And upon opening his eyes after the meditation, he was in that other country. He had been moved there by desire. The simple desire produced its own fulfillment. Now actually, probably the fable does not imply that he rode on some strange, mysterious, magical device like Dr. Faust on his way to Valpurgis Night. Actually, the point of the matter is that the individual is always in the state which is the consequence of his desire. One of the attributes of desire is mind. Therefore, it is mind that produces the person. Therefore, a man's thoughts make him. He does not make his thoughts. Therefore, in Buddhism, the thought always precedes the mind. And the thought always precedes the thinker, which to us seems an inconceivable thing, because we can scarcely conceive of a mind without recognizing that that mind must be the cause of the thoughts that come from it. This would be true if the mind was a fixed entity or a fixed being. But it is not. The mind is always the product of the association or the attributes of the skandhas, or these illusionary things which keep weaving a webwork. And this webwork creates and sustains the personality. So the personality is the consequence of sensation, desire, emotion, and thought. It is not the cause of them. The personality, therefore, changes with them. And these things think the self into existence, or move the self into existence by desire, by hunger, or by what Buddha called thirst. Thirst in this sense being the craving for existence. Man wishes to exist. Therefore, as long as he so wishes, he wishes his own existence into illusionary being. And the product of this is his sense of selfness. So the self cannot attain to reality because it is compounded of substances in themselves unreal. It can never sustain or survive its own nature. Now to take another group of legends which deal with a different type of thing. We have the hero legend in Buddhism, sometimes involving the monk, sometimes involving something very close in its nature or substance to the hero legend of Europe, but with a different psychological intention. One of the outstanding hero legends, of course, is the Tibetan saga of Geza Khan, which is the tremendous story of the hero self. Now, we've already learned that the hero self is forever and inevitably vulnerable. We know that from our Nordic mysteries, from our Greek mysteries, from our Egyptian rites, that the hero is always an immortal mortal and always dies. There is always something about the hero, whether it is the spot on Siegfried's shoulder where the leaf fell and where he did not receive the immortalizing power of the dragon's blood, or whether it was the heel of Achilles, the place where his mother held him when she dipped him into the waters of immortality, the place where her hand was the vulnerable point. Now the hero myth, whether it is in Asia or in any other area, is always a myth of the vulnerability of the being in certain respects. For example, in your Siegfried myth, in your Dionysus myth, in your Isdubad myth, in all of these, your hero is never all-knowing. Your hero can get himself into terrible difficulties In fact, most of the saga is the story of him extricating himself from difficulties he would never have been in if he was a totally heroic being. If Siegfried had really been the true embodied hero, he would have known that Hagen was going to drive the spear into his back. If he had been the truly perfect and complete being, he would have known that the wine was drugged, which caused him to pass into the state of a kind of hypnotic trance and lose his memory of his mission and his destiny. Had he been the true hero, he would not have been so short-sighted as to refuse to return the ring to the Nibelung, or return it, at least in the Siegfried saga, to the Rhine maidens, or to the keepers and natural custodians of the ring. But Siegfried did many foolish things, although he was the hero. So the self, which is always represented by the hero in Buddhism, is not a real first-class, number one hero. It is a curious combination of hero and heel, and they always are, and they always have been. Now, in the Geza Khan cycle in Tibet, we have the same thing. Here is an individual loaded with magical attributes and powers, destined to be born, a magnificent spiritual being in the Tushita heaven before embodiment, who made the gallant sacrifice for a consideration and took upon himself the embodiment. He then proceeds to do many wonderful and strange things, also many cruel and terrible things. He becomes utterly dominated by the concept of the end justifying the means, and certainly in his relationship to the problems of his peculiar embodiment, he broke every essential statute of Buddhism. Yet he is the Buddhist hero. Under the story of the Geza Khan, then, we have a very subtle statement of the hero as man's magnificent concept of himself. Each one of us is heroic, except we continue to make the most rudimentary mistakes. We have sufficient knowledge to inform all except ourselves. Advice, we give it abundantly. We practice itself. We know all kinds of solutions except those we need. And with all our long-headedness, we are consistently short-sighted. We are certain of ourselves, but never certain of what we're going to do. Thus, all these legends return to us the original concept that the hero, extending objectively into the sphere of phenomena, envisions itself as the ultimate conqueror of the world, whether it be the conqueror of worldliness, whether it be the fulfillment of ambition, the accumulation of possession, the conquest of natural forces, domination over almost anything, from the moving mountain stream to the mystery of atomic fission. The hero is always the one who is going to dominate, to succeed where all others have failed, to exhibit innumerable magical attributes, and, like the god Odin himself, to possess all knowledge except the knowledge of his own origin and destiny. and yet the hero inevitably dies. The hero does not achieve his end. In some mysterious and some infamous manner, his destiny, like the destiny of Hitler or Mussolini, is cut short. Like Napoleon, he ends at Elba. Like Alexander, he falls or ceases not far from Babylon. Always, this great path of glory leads but to the grave. Thus, the self, which is the symbol of the hero, is also the emblem of the ultimate frustration of man. For the one thing he cannot do, and never can do, is bestow immortality upon himself, or his self. His self cannot become that which he dreams it will be. It cannot go on and on to become godlike. And always the attempt to expand the power of the sattva exhausts the capacities of the energies which produced it, and therefore they can no longer direct it. It is controlled, limited, and restricted by the means and conditions of its own existence, and it cannot break that pattern. Now, this would cause us to assume that the loss of self would be the end of being, but this is not the case in the Buddhist concept, especially in the Northern School. For we have in this school a series of beings called bodhisattvas. And of course, Bodhi in this sense means enlightened. But the word sattva is a bit of a sticker. It does not translate as easily as we might think. We can translate it self, but to do so, we must have a different concept of self from anything we have in the West. We can translate it being, but that isn't quite right. We can't translate it as an essential condition. This is not quite right. The further we go, the more of the not quite rightness we come across. And perhaps it could be conceived of as wisdom, or the state of enlightened knowing, with the sattva representing the cognating power. But this isn't right, because enlightenment is not a cognating power. Perhaps then the only way we can really get some kind of a definition that is useful is to assume that a bodhisattva represents something which has achieved the enlightenment of knowing its own becoming. In other words, it has achieved to the state where it is aware that it cannot achieve, that it has reached the exhaustion of delusion, and that enlightenment, so far as it is possible in a being, is really not a positive light, but the recognition of basic error. Therefore, the bodhisattva is a being, or a ever becoming, much on the same level as the paradise of Amitabha. The bodhisattva is the extension of good. It represents that state in which the recognition of unreality is totally and completely accepted. And with it, the realization that this recognition is the source of bliss, the source of absolute emancipation. It is said that the Bodhisattva is upon the earth in a final or last incarnation, and having achieved this incarnation will not return. But let us go back now to some old Buddhist fables. There are a whole series of fables in which Buddhas of previous cycles, presumably having attained the nirvana, do come back. And that is something that causes us a little pause. Also, the beings that have assumedly achieved the nirvana may, under certain conditions, take upon themselves the appearance of embodiment and manifest themselves for a purpose and a reason to the disciples or to a world under crisis. This implies, beyond question of doubt, from early sources, that nirvana was not a state of extinction. It was a state, however, which can be explained in the terms of Buddha's own experience. And here we can remember the Dhammapada, and also particularly the closing symbolism of the Book of the Great Decease. Here we recognize the personification or the embodiment achieving the parinirvana through the final extinction of the ultimate karma, which consisted of the eating of the polluted meat, which meant that in this particular circumstance the teacher had paid the last bill, that there could be no further karma. Now, if this constituted then the state of the release, and the teacher or the Great One passed into meditation or into a profound state of contemplation, whereby yogic power he gradually disassociated his being from his personality and finally disassociated being itself and dissolved the complex of identity. Now what, we will assume, could then happen? Assuming then that this was a step from phenomenal to noumenal condition or existence, what happens? According to the teaching, this teacher became identical with all preceding beings that had attained the nirvana. By becoming thus identical, does it mean that he became simultaneously aware of them all and simultaneously experienced them all? Would the next Buddha, achieving the same end, simultaneously experience the preceding Buddha and all others? What is the state of being, or the state of essence, which can be totally experiencing and still be one? This means that the whole concept of nirvana postulates a completely different state upon which the premise of continuance can be based. A continuance of totality, capable at any time of the experience of individuality. If such is the case, then we know how the 5 primordial Buddha powers can will conditioned existence into being, because they possess the total of condition and unconditioned. Therefore, an entirely different dimension of consciousness exists. A consciousness which is not divided, and yet, being undivided, possesses universal awareness. That there is no longer the state of individual awareness, and all existing conditions of consciousness are experienced as within totality. Now, this creates another cycle of beliefs and doctrines, all of which are related to the ascent of man into this ultimate condition. In this whole concept of Buddhism, we have therefore also a great cyclic evolutionary drama, a drama which begins with the infinite and ends with it, a drama of infinite becoming, moving from the most subtle essences of space through all conditions, molecular, atomic, electronic, finally elementary, a becoming which achieves totality by the total experience of totality, and cannot be total while there is one fragment of unexperienced totality. The full and complete experience, therefore, is the same as a complete re-identification. Things are separate only by difference. All things that are different in degrees of ignorance. Therefore, when totality is experienced, there is no interval between that which experiences and that which is experienced, and totality reasserts itself. Then let us also see why, in this particular problem, every bodhisattva, every divine being must face Mara, the principle of the ultimate compound of illusion. Gautama Buddha, seated under the tree of the great determination, from which he resolved never to rise again unless he had attained the enlightenment, was immediately subjected to the assailing of Mara. And Mara has been termed the deity of evil. More essentially, Mara is not evil. And Buddha would have been the last to accuse Mara of being evil, although we are not quite so patient in our attitude toward the devil. But the devil, archetypally and psychologically, is identical with Mara. And Mara means or signifies basically one thing. And that one thing would be termed in Buddhism sensation. Sensation, which is the root of desire. Sensation is that internal quality or attribute of the skandhas by means of which the individual is placed in subjection to the reactions of corporeal or material existence upon the self, upon the sattva or the egoic complex. Mara, therefore, is sensation in the sense of man's total receptivity to stimuli, and sensation in this case is the basis of the thirst or hunger for gratification or satisfaction of that which is sensed or known. The sensation covers much more than the sensory perceptions, but let us use them as a symbol for it at the moment. Sight is a phase of sensation. Things seen affect us. We cannot escape from. The moment we open our eyes into this objective state, we become the victims of the faculty of sight. It is a strange fact, but notable, that persons born blind are nearly always happy. Because being deprived of sight, they are cut off from a whole series of consequences resulting from sight. Those who have lost their sight, it is not the same, because they have already known of these things. But a person who is born blind and loves someone will always live in the beauty of that person, who will never grow old and never change, because they have never been seen. Sight is one of the things that binds us relentlessly to a belief in the reality of matter. Sight sustains, and it also invites. Through sight, we suddenly observe the man with the new car. Thus, another sensation is stimulated within us, desire. And by the time sight gets through with us, it has whipped us thoroughly. It has locked us within a whole complex of attachments, of ambitions, and of instinctual and habitual practices. It has made us a copycat, for one thing. It has burdened us with the infinite necessity of watching television, which itself is little better, in most cases now, than a form of punishment. It may be better someday, it's improving, but at the moment it has much to be desired. Sight binds us to cyclic phenomena. It produces an immense verification of itself. And though we do not realize it, passions rise from sight. Appetites arise from sight. Therefore, what would happen if there was nothing to be seen? We come back to the old problem of would there be any noise if there wasn't anyone to hear it? Supposing now there was no phenomenal universe which could be reached by the five sensory perceptions. Supposing the individual existed in a vacuum. Under such conditions, what would his state be? We've already stated it. He would exist in a vacuum. He would have no desires, no activities, no interests, no attachments, no likes, no dislikes, no ambitions, and, of course, no opportunity for temporal delight and no necessity for temporal pain. Because none of these things can have any existence in him except that existence which is called forth, as Kundry was invoked by Klingsor, called forth by externals. So externals pull out the inner energies of man, externalize them, and cause them to fashion themselves into patterns. The supreme one of these patterns being the self, which is the total of all the pressures of phenomena, and all man's reaching out to embrace the objects of desire or sensation. If then these objects were not there, the sensations within man could not operate. Now the objects are there. Therefore these internal energies operate incessantly. But man is not required merely to continue indefinitely in this procedure. He possesses the power within himself to discriminate between objects. And this is the beginning of an energy which itself rises from karma. This power to discriminate causes him to possess the ability to experience through material conditions until they no longer stimulate sensation. He cannot prevent them from existing, but he can no longer respond to them. It is like a person who perhaps will gorge himself on a certain kind of food, but presented with a food he does not like, he will not eat it. Therefore, like and dislike, acceptance or non-acceptance, determines the intensity of sensations. Buddhism consequently teaches that if man firmly understands the truth about the matter, he will instinctively and inevitably relax his grip upon the sensational sphere and will gradually sublimate his instincts and appetites until he will respond gradually to only the most subtle and least gross of the phenomenal illusions, and ultimately will find supreme contentment in a complete dissociation from them. This is the monastic life. This is the way in which the old pattern was set up. Because there is no good and evil in the essential teaching, and because Mara simply means this locked sensation, the arising of Mara before the young prince who was to become the Buddha during the Enlightenment represents the tremendous impact of the phenomenal world and the decision that had to be made. The decision to reject the phenomenal and in this way to subdue sensation or overcome Mara or illusion. And having had a victory over sensation through internal consciousness, the Buddha was then free from the material. Having achieved freedom from the material, the Buddha was then, and then only, according to the Buddhist tradition, capable of revealing the doctrine, because he could not reveal the doctrine until he was free from what might be termed his own intent of interpretation. Sensation carries with it interpretation, and the doctrine can only be revealed by the individual who does not try to explain it, or does not try to apply it, or who does not try to interpret it in some mode, mood, or way. The revelation of the law is therefore, in its completeness, only possible to the individual who is completely disassociated from the pressure of sensation, and is therefore, as in the Hindu classic, unmoved in pain and pleasure, and thereby suited for immortality. Having thus achieved the suspension of sensation, the teacher was prepared for his mission. Now, the Buddhist legends and paintings, particularly the pictures of the 16, in some cases 18 Lohans in the Chinese group, also include this concept of the Buddha in the golden pagoda of the heart, an essential element of the heart doctrine. And in this concept, the being, or the human being, is conceived of as possessing the Buddha potency within itself. Now this is, again, very close to Christianity, because the Christ in you is the hope of glory. Now the Buddha in you is tremendously and wonderfully significant, except in Buddhism, the Buddha in you is a potential. It does nothing. It does not save you. But it is the statement of your participation in totality. In other words, the Buddha in you will transform nothing, regenerate nothing, redeem nothing. Because it can do no more for you than space around you. Because space is also completely and fully permeated with the same power. The Buddha in your brother cannot reach you, nor can it always reach him. The Buddha in the sky, or in the sun, or in the rain. Well, this power is everywhere. But this power in itself, this essence, which is the essence of totality, or the potential of reality, cannot move out, cannot possess, cannot take over, because it cannot will. It cannot pity you, because it cannot have sensation. Now, to the Western mind, this sounds as though this principle was awfully, coldly impersonal. But it isn't. It cannot be sorry for you, because actually and factually, sorrow and all these things are part of the illusion, and we cannot expect reality to blaze forth with all these illusionary attributes. It does not do so. So the regeneration and redemption philosophy in the symbolism of Buddhism is not the saving power of totality saving you. It is your job to save it. Not in the sense that it can be destroyed, but in the sense that it can only be experienced by you when you have redeemed it. When you have made your own statement of totality. Up to that time, this power in you is subject to your own definition of it. One man may say that reality in him is God in him, and that this God is an ever merciful power, seeking always his good. All that he is factually saying is that an eternal essence exists within him. The rest is his own interpretation of that. Everywhere the human being is seeking easy ways out of his dilemmas. Nature provides none. What nature provides, however, is a certain way. A way which, strangely enough, is not difficult, and not barren, and not terrible. For as Buddha himself said, the way to the enlightenment is far easier than the path of ignorance. Actually, the individual who seeks the real is happier every step of the way than the person who does not. The sincere and devout person, therefore, does not need the compassion of an interceding power. His own conduct is forever rewarding him. It is his own sense of values that grows and bestows upon him the constant benediction of understanding. We in our ignorance cry out to be understood. The Buddha power cries out to understand. As long as we desire to be understood, we will suffer. As soon as we desire to understand, we will be relieved of suffering to that degree. And to the degree that this desire grows and matures within us, we realize that it is our task to understand totality. And in so doing, to build ever more accurate legends, fables, images, and forms of it, until finally, transcending form, we discover universal not form to be the only appropriate form which it can take. As the doctrine says, only the unembodiedness can be the perfect body of the Lord, for everything else falls short of itself. Those who embody it destroy it, but those who in themselves remove its bodies release it. Therefore, the ever-being is released to our awareness through our own understanding of it. Regeneration, redemption are in the hands of man. It is not that he should be saved in the sense of having his personality infinitely projected. It is that he should be redeemed or transformed by the illumination. An illumination being the recognition of the transitory and the unchanging. Now this does not lead to non-action. Buddha was far too practical for that. Actually, he had very little interest in trying to find definitions for the gods and Buddhas and sages and saints that had gone before. Like the famous Mephisto in Faust, he saw alone man's self-inflicted pains, how the little world God still his stamp retains, as wondrous now as on the primal day. Better, alas, for him poor white that ye conceal the heavenly light. Reason he names it, but doth use it so each day more brutish than the brute doth grow. That was the sorrowful wail of Mephisto at the footstool of divinity in the prologue to Faust. Actually, Buddha realized that man cannot conceive the ultimate, nor can he immediately attain it. Therefore, the problem was the immediate assistance of the individual, in a way, however, which was not an illusion, or at least contributed no further to the delusion. A way which infinitely extended would lead to reality. A way of things to be done that need never again be undone. No further trial or error. Perhaps only one step, but that step in the direction of eternity. The important thing was that each step produced of itself an immediate and obvious result. Each degree of attainment of man, by means of which he achieves a victory over sensation, perception, and desire, is an immediate cause for the reduction of misery. The farmer, the householder, by achieving one correction within his nature, removes one source of sorrow. And therefore, even a fraction of 1% gain may in conduct transform a life. And the moment life is approached with this strange, deep, abiding honesty, the moment an individual begins to realize that he does not have to do a thing because he feels like it, the moment he realizes he does not have to make a mistake because he can't help it, the moment he realizes that it is perfectly possible to achieve a gradual relaxation of attachments so that he can use without possession. As each step of the way brings with it a corresponding weakening of the power of illusion over living, the individual gains a new tranquility, a new perspective, a new tolerance. The mere recognition that the end of life is not success but enlightenment helps to make the man a better father, a better husband, and a better son. It relaxes him away from the terrifically psychotic intensity of living for the gratification of sensation. He begins to know that in this gratification there is nothing but darkness and death. That no matter what he does, he is causing consequences which he must endure. His first and natural move, therefore, is not to suspend all action. He cannot, because no man can do nothing until that is the only thing that remains to be done. He can never arrive prematurely, because he can never suspend action until the last cause of action ceases. What he can do, however, is moderate action. He can also recognize the importance of the choice of those things which are better, so that consequences are calmed, pulling the sattva back into embodiment, brings it into an embodiment of reward rather than punishment. That the being can gradually increase in good works, and in so doing achieve a higher level within this continuing structure of illusion, and that each such advancement can be distinguished by a notable improvement and alteration in character and temperament. Most of all, Buddhism insists that these steps must be the voluntary decision of the individual. He will never overcome illusion until it is the thing which he most desires to do. This desire becomes, therefore, the bodhisattva of the skandhas of desire. In other words, recognizing a series of illusionary concepts which go together, the 5 illusions which go together to make the personality. Each one of these illusions can reach its own apex and have its own last illusion. The last illusion of passion is compassion. Therefore, it is a bodhisattva, the last embodiment.